When you think about philosophical novels, you might think about writers like Fyodor Dostoevsky or Leo Tolstoy or maybe even Ayn Rand. But I wanted to take a look today at some novels that I think have a lot of philosophical merit to them, discuss some of those philosophical themes and why you should read them. And the first book I wanted to talk about was The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. Kundera was a Czech and French writer. He sadly passed away just last year. The Unbearable Lightness of Being is sort of a philosophical exploration of not a Nietzschean idea, but an exact inversion of an idea from Nietzsche. In a section of The Gay Science that Nietzsche titled The Heaviest Weight, he asked the reader to consider the possibility that a demon has visited you, and then put forward the idea that life will repeat over and over again the exact same sequence of events. This is an idea that Nietzsche would call eternal return. It's also sometimes called eternal recurrence. Nietzsche posited that this would be a heavy weight. It would be a kind of burden, knowing that life was an endless cycle. And Nietzsche thought that it was a sign of personal strength if one were able to accept that burden and still experience a kind of joy. So if the world repeats over and over again in the same kind of endless cycle, this is a heavy burden. But Kundera instead wants you to think about, what if we know that life only really happens once? So life is basically as we understand it today. And instead of this being a heavy burden, this is an actual lightness of being. But this lightness of being brings its own challenges. In particular, Kundera is obsessed with this idea that if life can only be lived once, then all of the choices that you make are done with a certain kind of ignorance. You will never know the consequences of your choices while you're making the choice. And thus we get the title, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. This is a really great novel if you are interested in those Nietzschean ideas, but maybe you're looking for someone who isn't just going to parrot Nietzsche. I mean, frankly, if you want a novel that's going to give you Nietzschean ideals, then you should just read Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The idea of the eternal return actually is a big theme in that novel as well, and Nietzsche wrote it, so it's probably the best Nietzschean novel ever written. There's obviously influenced by Nietzsche, but he's shifting those concerns as well. Now we're going to talk about a few other important novels, but before that, I want to thank today's sponsor, Day One. Regular viewers of this channel know that I love to journal. I try and make journaling a regular part of my life. In fact, it is one of my daily habits. And sometimes I don't have time to get out a notebook and a pen and write by hand. And on those days, I use Day One. Day One is a journaling app with a ton of features, and if you use Day One, I think you're going to find it easier to journal more. The whole point is to make the process as easy and simple as possible. And they are offering a 2-month trial of Day One Premium to anyone who uses the code Henderson. There's a URL right here on the screen for you. Use the code Henderson to get a 2-month free trial of Day One Premium. With Day One, you can organize your journal entries, you can import photos, add drawings, or even record audio if that's more convenient for you. But hands down, my favorite feature is the ability to go back and see my old entries. Whether it's searching by year or location or using keywords, Day One makes it super simple for me to go back and see my old journal entries. I first started using Day One in 2018. That means I can look back at journals from half a decade ago with ease. So try Day One today. Go to dayoneapp.com/Henderson and use the code Henderson for a 2-month free trial of Day One Premium. Thanks again to Day One for sponsoring this video. When I was making this video, I decided to look at other lists of philosophical novels that had been compiled. I don't think I ever saw this next book on the list, which I think is really surprising because I do think it's a deeply philosophical novel, and that's Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. I first read this novel when I was in high school. It was one of those assignments in an English class where we were told to pick a book. I was told that Catch-22 is funny, and I wanted to read a funny book, so I read it myself for my book report. I don't think anything could have quite prepared me for Catch-22. Oftentimes, this novel is painted as an anti-war novel, which is correct, and an exploration of the absurdity of modern bureaucracy. In this way, Heller has a lot in common with, say, like Kafka. And that description of Heller's book is correct as well. But I think there's something a lot deeper going on in this novel. So the main character of this novel is Yossarian. If you don't know the basic idea, Yossarian is a fighter pilot in World War II, and he is constantly being told that he has to fly more and more missions, to the point where he begins to fear his own government more than he fears fears the Germans that he's supposed to be fighting. After all, the government keeps raising the number of missions he needs to fly before he can be sent home, and they've created more absurd policies which have made it impossible for him to be sent home early. And I don't think I could have realized this at the time, because I don't think I really would have been in a position to understand it, but this is a novel about trauma. This is a novel about really post-traumatic stress disorder, or what we might have called shell shock back in the day. And at the heart of this novel, there's a discussion of something that we know of as the problem of evil. The problem of evil is a problem in the philosophy of religion. Very, very roughly, the idea is that if the Christian God exists, and so this is a God who is all good, all powerful, all knowing, then we need some kind of explanation for why there is evil in the world. If you're doing more theology rather than philosophy, this discussion is often lumped under the idea of theodicy. In chapter 18 of this book, so right in the middle, Yossarian gets into this argument where he finally says something really profound. Just don't tell me that God works in mysterious ways. There's nothing so mysterious about it. He's not working at all. He's playing, or else he's forgotten all about us. That's the kind of God you people talk about. And then after a while, Yossarian continues, why in the world did he ever create pain? Religious believers and non-believers alike have been asking that question for centuries. You can see it in the works of St. Augustine. In his Confessions, he's meditating on evil, and this is where he gives a theory of evil as a privation of being rather than a thing that exists, though that alone doesn't seem to solve the problem of evil. Charles Darwin, I think, writes about this in some of his notebooks, because as he's thinking about a theory of evolution, he's also thinking about the problem of animal suffering, and this problem of suffering not just in the human world, but in the non-human world. And he's trying to rectify this with the belief in some kind of good God. This is an idea that Voltaire is satirizing in his novel Candide, which has as its target this Leibnizian idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds. But I think for many people, especially those who are inclined to religious belief but are struggling with it, the problem of evil is actually something that felt in your bones. And it's something that you deal with more on an existential level rather than weighing the evidence using something like a Bayesian calculation or something. And it's Heller's novel that captures that really well. It's why I think Catch-22 deserves to be classified as a philosophical novel. Now, so much I want to talk about Fyodor Dostoevsky's work, like Crime and Punishment, which viewers of this channel might know is my favorite novel, or The Brothers Karamazov, which is arguably Dostoevsky's masterpiece. Or we could bring up some of Tolstoy's more existentialist writings. But I decided I was going to try to look past the standard recommendations for philosophical novels in this video and look for those other novels, kind of like Catch-22, that still teach us a lot about philosophy, even if they're not the ones that you would typically be recommended. And one novel that really stands out to me is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco, by the way, wrote this great book called How to Write a Thesis. If you are a graduate student or even an undergrad working on a thesis, you should read Eco's book. It was very helpful to me in graduate school. Consider that like a free tip. The Name of the Rose is an historical novel which is set in the early 14th century. And in this novel, we have two monks, Adso and William, who are meeting at a monastery, and they are there to mediate some theological disputes between some offshoots of the Franciscans and the Pope. But while they are at the monastery, there are a series of murders. And so this novel, while deeply philosophical, is also fundamentally like a murder mystery. It's like a historical fiction murder mystery, which makes it a really great page turner. But Eco is a philosopher, and so much of this novel is about the relationship between signs or like words or images and that which they're signifying. And we could probably do a much longer video just talking about the background of semiotics in Eco's writing. But another great instance of Eco inserting philosophy into his novel is through the character of William of Baskerville. Now, William of Baskerville seems to be kind of a blend of two figures, one fictional and one real. That fictional character is Sherlock Holmes, because William really is the kind of logical detective in this story, but he's also based on the medieval philosopher William of Ockham. Now, I was looking around to see some analysis of The Name of the Rose, and some people say that he's also inspired by the philosopher and theologian Roger Bacon. And that's fair, except Bacon is referenced in the story as a colleague of William's and as someone that William knows and respects. And so it just seems a little weird to say that William is also based on Roger Bacon when Roger Bacon does exist in the story. So Sherlock Holmes is obviously famous for this idea of using deduction. Philosophers actually kind of hate that description of Sherlock Holmes. He's not doing strictly deductive reasoning. He's actually doing what we sometimes call inference to the best explanation, which is also sometimes called abductive reasoning, but people quibble about whether it should be called that too. And William of Ockham is sort of famous for this idea of Occam's razor. This is sometimes simplified into the idea that we should always prefer the simpler explanation. And William has also picked up this idea of empiricist epistemology from Roger Bacon, and he's seen the kind of fruits of it because Bacon's even shown him success in the science of optics, which is one of Bacon's big contributions to European knowledge at the time. And so William takes this kind of empirical approach to trying to solve this murder by eliminating possibilities, by conducting investigations. He is fighting against superstition throughout the novel, and some of the antagonists of the novel end up being the promoters of the most rigid kind of orthodoxy, and William is always rubbing them the wrong way. And so I actually think that William is kind of the stand-in for the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment hasn't happened yet in the universe, but he is sort of the stand-in for the Enlightenment that is to come. This doesn't speak to the philosophical merit of this novel, but I just want to add that even in translation, and there's kind of a standard translation of this novel by William Weaver, even in translation, Eco is like one of the great prose stylists. I wish I could read Italian because I want to read Eco in his own language. The book is like sensual in its beauty and its richness, and I can't recommend it enough. All right, so those are just a few philosophical classics. There are so many other philosophical novels that we could talk about. The works of Dostoevsky. You could talk about Ayn Rand if you really wanted to. I was thinking about talking about DeLillo and the problem of the simulacra and postmodernism. David Foster Wallace deserves to be in this discussion, as well as a bunch of science fiction and fantasy like you might have seen in some other videos of mine. So I would love to hear your favorite philosophical novels down below.